I finally managed to play my first game of 11th edition, and I just wanted to give my thoughts on it here on this Saturday before the first major update to 11th edition happens. I'm Thomas, this is Elderwood Games. Welcome back, everybody. So, 11th edition has been around for about a month now, and while it has been around for a month and I've spent a lot of time in the hobby, today was the first time I was able to get a game in. I was able to play 2,000 points of Tyranids against 2,000 points of Astra Militarum, and it was actually a lot of fun. I felt like the system still works very well. A lot of it still feels very reminiscent of 10th edition, and not really a ton has changed, but I wanted to talk about some of the things that I feel have changed, maybe for the better, maybe for the not so better, and then maybe talk a little bit about the changes I'm hoping to see. Let's start with army construction. So one thing that I feel that some people have missed is force dispositions. Now, obviously this is a pretty integral part of how 11th edition works, but some people that either got into it maybe towards the end of 10th edition or are coming back now that it's a new edition aren't really aware of how force dispositions work, and that you're pretty much limited to a single disposition per detachment, and a lot of the detachments that newer players use or more specified players maybe use are going to be the bigger detachment point detachments, and they're only being able to run one and having to run basically the mission determined by that. I'm not necessarily saying that that's a bad thing, that you only have the one mission. That kind of makes it easier, and you're able to sort of fit your army into sort of the niche of that particular disposition. But it really just seems more of an issue of players just aren't aware that it's a thing. And when you ask someone like, oh, hey, what's your army's force disposition? They're like, what's a force disposition? And then you have to kind of like walk them through building the, like, on the app. And I will say this, with the new updates to the app, when you initially make your army, it does force you to choose the force disposition after selecting your detachments. But if you're carrying over your stuff from 10th edition, you're not automatically prompted to add in that force disposition. One of the more recent updates, it seems, has added that in, and you'll get the little yellow icon at the bottom that says that you have an error, and doing that helps you kind of understand where to go to get your disposition picked. But at the same time, I think there's just a little bit of communication that's needed. But usually after you do that for the first time, they know how to build it, and it's not really an issue going forward. And of course, after a force disposition is determined, then whichever dispositions you two are choosing determines your mission. And I really like the force disposition primary missions. I do think maybe there are some that might need to be tweaked a little bit, some that are really easy to earn a lot of points in, and others that it kind of struggles to earn the points at the same rate. But I do think that they feel unique enough, and because they are so unique, you're able to kind of build your army to fit what is there. And I will say, at least from the Tyranid side of things, obviously it's my first game, and I just ran with Invasion Fleet. It's the one I knew, so getting the hang of the new rules, I just wanted something comfortable. And I felt like taking hold with Tyranids and Invasion Fleet felt fine. I do think that it could be a Purge the Foe one, and it could be really strong in that, and that might be why they chose not to do it. But in certain matchups, like with Astra Militarum, I was playing against a Hammer of the Emperor, so a lot of tanks. So even with my lethal hits on everything, it was still pretty difficult to knock some stuff out, unless it was being shot with my Norn or Tyrannifex. But other things were kind of struggling to keep up with that sort of thing. So I was having to more so do the runaround missions with Taking Hold, which actually ended up working in my favor. And of course, after you decide your force dispositions and which primary missions you're going to be playing, then you go into the app, into the tournament section, and you can find the specific terrain layout to use for that matchup. Obviously, you can set up your own table. It's not really required to do the terrain layouts, but I feel like right now, with us being in a new edition, it makes the most sense to use the thing that they sort of built a lot of the rules around. So at least in my shop, we're still using the terrain footprints, but we'll talk a little bit about my hopes for terrain later in the video. And I will admit, setting up terrain is a bit of a chore. I felt like in 10th edition, it wasn't a lot, but it was still kind of a lot. And I feel like in this edition, it is a lot more. I do think that the terrain layouts for 11th edition are better than the ones in 10th edition. I find that there's more access to firing lanes in unique ways, and they're not really as gotcha feeling as some of the 10th edition ones, but also it does feel a bit cramped between the terrain pieces. If you don't know, the terrain footprints are actually quite big, some of them being about the size of a piece of letter-sized paper, which I didn't really, you see the number of what size they're going to be, but until you like hold one in your hand, it kind of is a bit shocking. It's like, wow, that's a lot of space. Like a lot of stuff can fit on this, and it's going to be blocking a lot of things. I was able to easily hide my terrain effects from my opponent's Baneblade and Shadow Sword and his other tanks very easily, and be able to move in a way that I basically would almost always either be unable to be shot or have cover, which I think is a good thing. I want to say that real quick. But also, because they were so big, I was never really feeling like I was out of the open, even with us having some sparse-ish terrain. And while that's good, I do think some of the setup time is rough. And when I was reading through some of the Tacoma Open updates and kind of how they want, or how they sort of expect players to interact with the terrain, basically making it so that players are kind of assigned the footprint that they need to set up, but having to set that up, I just honestly, I would not like that. I think that it would probably be better for there to be some other organization of how the tables are set up and how your opponents are matched to be able to more easily move you to a table that makes sense. The issue kind of is, though, that there are specific primary missions that require a certain number of terrain areas within no man's land or within your territory. And so there are limitations of that particular thing. So if you end up getting on a bad table that maybe doesn't have enough or maybe has too many, it could give you a disadvantage or advantage depending on what your primary mission is. So that's an update that I hope to see. Overall, I think the setup is maybe a little bit more taxing. We obviously want to get into games a bit quicker, but the trade-off is that I do think that some of the terrain rules are a little bit better in 11th edition than in 10th, and it has more room for interpretation in a good way. So it's kind of picking your battles at this point. So I'm hoping that throughout the edition we might be able to find a way to streamline table setup, but we'll just have to wait and see. As far as actual gameplay goes, it's about normal. I didn't really seem to find much difference while playing the game. Everything still felt very familiar to me from 10th edition, and although I may have sounded a bit critical of the fast rolling in previous videos, I honestly found that it doesn't really come up all that much unless you're a very big unit punching or shooting into a already mostly damaged unit where your number of attacks greatly outweighs the number of models and groups that your opponent has. Thankfully, Tyranids don't really experience that too often. I think if I was into a more infantry heavy list, or playing against a more infantry heavy list rather, and I was doing the sustained hits, I do think it probably would have come up a bit more, but I still feel like it made a lot of sense. I was able to easily kind of judge from my opponent and be like, do you want these to go into Yarick first or into your Kriegsman first, that sort of thing, to be able to kind of talk through all that fun stuff. I think one of the biggest impacts was the battle shock. So Tyranids, obviously we like battle shock, and forcing it onto our opponents is advantageous for a lot of our units, especially the Neurolictor. I can understand now why that thing went up in points. The -1 to hit that it gives as an aura when something is battle shocked, and the +1 to wound into something in its aura when that thing is battle shocked is pretty tremendous. And when you are able to sort of couple that by basically forcing a strong unit into battle shock for a turn, and then be able to basically force it back into it the next turn, either with its ability to force the battle shock or with shadows, you can almost like stun lock something and basically make that thing unable to hit anything. Basically, one of my opponent's Baneblades was hitting on 6s because it was battle shock, so he couldn't give it orders. I was basically in cover wherever he was trying to shoot, and the -1 to hit, all that stacked together, basically giving him a -2 to hit, -1 ballistic, -1 to hit, forcing him into 6. And it was pretty devastating for the player. Basically, their Baneblade could do nothing. I was able to very easily just kind of walk off of some of those things. And, you know, they shot into some of my Gaunt units and stuff like that. And sure, those things died, but that's kind of what they're meant to do, soak up some fire, while my bigger things are able to advance up the board and take some presence. But yeah, I think Battle Shock and basically having to lift it every turn instead of it automatically clearing can become a bit of a snowball if your opponent gets bad rolls, or if you consistently have ways to give a minus or other negative modifier. Another obvious big change is the charge roll system. I really like it. I felt like it gave you more agency as the player to be able to move where you needed to and be able to get into a more advantageous position. Because obviously if there's something you want to charge and you need like a 4, but then you end up rolling a 10, you can move, you know, onto the opposite side of that thing and be able to get into cover or get behind a terrain piece to be able to hide yourself from something. Maybe you're actually able to do the long bomb into something that you would have much rather charged than the thing that you were just going to settle with. And it just ended up causing a couple of instances of, you know, oh, actually, I'm going to slightly change my initial plan going into the charge phase and do this instead. And I really found that sort of gameplay loop very satisfying. I felt like I had more control over what my units were doing, and I wasn't like hoping for a specific result so my stuff isn't just out in the open. And I think there's twofold on that. Obviously, you have more options now, because if you fail the long bomb that you wanted, you might be able to move into something closer. But also there's the amount of terrain, and you're much less likely to have something just out in the open as a sitting duck in 11th edition. At least that's what I've found. Moving on to the secondary and just scoring in general, I find that the primary missions are great. They feel pretty thematic. Obviously, I've just played the Unstoppable Force and Movable Object, which is Taken Hold versus Purge the Foe. But I really found that, you know, I was able to do what I needed to, which is only just, you know, I'm standing on footprints, right? That's all I really needed to do. And my opponent was just trying to kill my units and that sort of thing. So being able to hold objectives, and as I'm holding objectives, getting cover to make it more difficult for my opponent to do the thing that they want to do. And obviously my opponent wants to also deny objectives for me, get in, well, in a lot of cases they'll want to get in close. Guard is a little different, but there were plenty of times where the Baneblade was on the objective I wanted and I just couldn't out OC it, because every time I moved my, you know, 20 OC gaunts on there, they would just be wiped out in an instant. So had to do a little bit of balancing and that sort of thing. And then the secondary missions, it feels very much the same as 10th edition, at least when you're scoring them, but the ability to stockpile those is very nice. And there were times where I just decided to score the thing, and I think I might need to learn to be maybe a bit more patient and hold on to secondaries when I know I can maybe score the bigger version of it. You know, there were some times where I just misread something. The whole territory thing is new, where basically your territory is the half of the board that your deployment zone is on. And that tripped me up a couple times where I didn't realize I needed to be outside of my territory in order to get the bigger points buff and that sort of thing. But then also like seeing the board state, realizing that even if I were to have it the following turn, to be able to do that, I would have to really detract from some of my other game plans or put stuff into positions where I didn't feel like they would be best used, which is part of it, right? You're trying to do the most optimal thing that you can while being able to score the most points that you can based on your primary and secondary scores. So it's one of those things. It's part of the game, and it's part of the game that I actually really like, having to make those decisions of, am I going to, you know, allocate my resources to kill this thing? Am I going to allocate my resources to do this action? Am I going to allocate my resources to get closer to the edge of the board and out of combat to be able to score this extra, 2 or 3 extra points that might stack up for the end of the game, and that sort of thing. So now let's talk a little bit about maybe some of the directions I hope that this, rules update that is coming this week addresses. Firstly, I would like some more carefully worded rules around the benefit of cover and line of sight. It's not that people don't understand how it works. Like, in theory, it's like, okay, from a point on your model, can you see the entirety of the model that you are shooting at? If yes, then they don't get cover. If no, they get cover. Or obviously if that model is within the terrain footprint, right? That's something that we can kind of all understand. However, for newer-ish players, when you have a tank that can see something and there's no walls in the way of it, right? It's just open season, but just these footprints, basically carpets on the battlefield in between their tank that is massive and your bug that is not as massive. In their minds, they're thinking, okay, I'm going to shoot my big cannon at that big bug and I'm going to kill it. And then you have to say, well, because of where I'm located, you can't see it because I'm behind this terrain footprint, which represents like a ruined portion of this city that we're fighting in. And, some people need to be able to disconnect themselves, maybe suspend their belief for a second, to be able to kind of examine that. And for some people that may be kind of difficult. And I think by the end of my game today, my opponent was kind of understanding how that works. But I think to them, there was a logical aspect to it of, well, it's flat. Like, I can see it, so why can't I do the thing? And I think there's room, obviously, for some interpretation there. 11th edition really leans heavily on the terrain footprints. And I don't necessarily know if that's 100% a good thing. I think it's like 85% a good thing. It gives you kind of defined areas. It allows you to play a game with, just some cutouts of pieces of paper that you can print from a local print shop or, tape together to make what you need and be able to play a game. And while you won't have walls and stuff to help with line of sight stuff on those things, you're still going to get a lot of instances of benefit of cover and be able to play the game in an effective way without having to invest in buying terrain and that sort of thing. Speaking on terrain, I would like to, maybe after this update and maybe after the monthly updates, the more frequent updates that they were announcing that they were doing here at the beginning of the edition, I would like to take a look at making some like custom or more narrative terrain layouts, and either have that be something that's baked into the rules and have some more one-sided kind of battles. I think it'd be cool to have sort of a fortified side with maybe quite a few terrain footprints with maybe some minimal spacing in between to represent a more guarded city or fortress kind of thing, and then have the smaller sort of walls sort of represent maybe a junkyard or some rocks and outcroppings of a wasteland outside of it. And one side of the battlefield is they're holding their home, and the other one is the invading force coming to take that. And they have to sort of crawl up the battlefield, get into, little pockets where they can't be seen by the enemy forces, move up, and then eventually get behind the city wall to be able to get in and wreak havoc. I think that sounds like a lot of fun, and I think that the terrain rules would allow for something like that to be done. It's just we have to break out of the mold of the sort of tournament terrain pieces, and you have to be with people that want that more narrative style of gameplay. Thankfully, I play in a shop that really leans on narrative gameplay, and we're more about having fun than having, maybe what you would call a balanced game, right? If my Blood Angels friend wants to basically recreate the defending of Baal, and my Tyranids are coming in and they're, holding down and keeping us out. I think that could be a lot of fun, and there could be a lot of cool ways to set up the terrain in a way that could evoke that feeling of protecting this stronghold, even with just some, flat pieces on the battlefield. And I think that's a really cool way to get us into the mindset of like, this is a game, this is meant to be sort of an expression of creativity, of not just like our skills of building and painting, but also the expression of our creative thoughts and that sort of thing. So that's something that I want to try. I don't think that's going to be in the rules updates or anything like that, but I do think that I would like to see some more clear kind of terrain specific rules on line of sight that truly explains how do we draw line of sight, what truly determines that we can see that model, and just to make sure that there's no room for like loopholes and stuff like that. And I understand some rules need to have that to allow for some creative and narrative kind of play, but I do think that some of the core foundational rules like line of sight, which is something that everything has to rely on, it would just be nice to like have something that feels more concrete. Outside of some of those updates, what I'd really like to see is some datasheet updates. I feel like a lot of things are still with the assumption that cover is granting the reduction of armor penetration. And while I think that's a good thing now for things that, have like 1 or 2 AP that were really hindered by cover stripping that away, what we're seeing on the flip side of that are units and abilities that don't care so much about the reduction of armor penetration because it was so easy to get it with cover. And what we still have are quite a few units that are able to ignore modifiers to ballistic skill and that sort of thing, or ignore cover, so they're not hindered by this new obstacle, and they're also not hindered by the old obstacle that they were originally designed for. So some things are able to kind of steamroll because of that sort of compounding effect, while other things are built with the idea of being able to give itself a certain thing, like giving itself the benefit of cover, which initially was meant to help it be more survivable from the wound roll, right? To be able to reduce AP and be able to make their saves a bit easier, to now making them more difficult to hit, which some things benefit from, but others don't. Things that already have stealth added on that have effects that grant that, like the benefit of cover. A good example of this would be something like the Venomthropes in Tyranids. So these guys have the ability to create an aura, and most things within the aura get stealth and benefit of cover. Monsters just get stealth, but now stealth is benefit of cover. So it's like everything gets the one benefit, but you're stripped of the old one. So just some like little things where I think there are some units that may now be better than they should be, and a few instances where I think units could be better if it would, maybe reinterpret the old benefit of cover rule, like reducing armor penetration into those rules. The next thing I kind of wanted to discuss a little bit about is just some speculation. So one of the speculation pieces is that Oath of Moment may be going away, and we might have T5 intercessors for Space Marines. So Oath of Moment currently, you pick a thing, you can reroll hits against it if you're Codex compliant, as in not one of the separate factions of Space Marines. You also get +1 to wound. It appears that their army rule may be shifting to an older Space Marine kind of rule, where you'll have tactical doctrines that you go into at the beginning of your turn, and these will be things that increase your movement, give you assault, give you extra strength and armor penetration, things that will help you in the heat of battle, but maybe aren't as cut and dry as just a simple reroll to hit. I think that portion is potentially a good thing. I feel like it will give you a little bit of, I have the cards in my hand and I'm able to sort of play them in the order that I wish to. I do think an odd thing about it is that the Gladius Task Force and the Librarian Enclave are something similar, right? They're 3-time use abilities that apply an effect for the turn, and then you can't use them again the rest of the game unless you use stratagems and that sort of thing. I think that having that and have it not be just like a simple like I'm going to be good at killing the thing. It's like now we can utilize their army rule for all the force dispositions in a way that is effective for the game. And I do think it's probably a good direction to do it. And they'll likely gain some kind of, you know, maybe it's a stratagem, maybe it's, you know, some units have this ability of Oath of Moment as something else. You know, they might still call it Oath of Moment, honestly. And it just be the same rule that it is now. It's just now it's on a character or now it's on a stratagem. And you can still do it. It just costs a CP. And they might end up, you know, making it a little bit sweeter, right? They might make it so that way you get extra strength or maybe some extra AP against your Oath of Moment target, since it will cost you a bit extra with it being like a command point or two and that sort of thing. Now the increased toughness. Obviously this one is truly speculation. I'm not really sure where this rumor exactly came from. I have seen a few other content creators kind of talk about it and that sort of thing. And I am okay with Space Marines being tougher. I think that makes sense. From a lore aspect, they are meant to be nigh unstoppable warriors. And I do think even this little bump of toughness is going to have a pretty big rippling impact. Since they're T4 right now, there's a lot of things that are strength 4 or strength 5, not into like strength 8 where you're going to be able to wound on 2s necessarily, but in this like 4 to 5 range, usually you're going to be wounding on 4s or 3s. But now you're wounding on 5s or 3s for basic infantry, which is basically what Space Marines are right now based on their point value and, you know, distribution and everything. That is not great, right? You wouldn't want Tyranids to have swarm units that are, you know, 3 up save, 5 toughness, 2 wounds pop, OC2, bunch of stuff, right? Like that would be really threatening at the points value they are, right? You know, for Tyranids at least, you know, 10 of them is 70, but for, you know, 10 intercessors, it's like 120, 130. However, that's still pretty low, and you can have a like pseudo like horde level army of Space Marines, and it'd be a viable list and be a legal list based on, you know, all the rules within Warhammer currently. And I mean, that would be just an absolute slog. I think if they're gonna do that, we need to push Space Marine points up, and or we need to maybe widen some of the gaps of strength in weapons, of toughness among other units, and consider, you know, what are the dominoes that this is going to start to push over as we kind of walk through this new edition and these updates. But what are your thoughts on 11th edition? Have you been able to play any games? Are you hesitant and waiting for some of this like rigorous playtesting and updating to be done before you really invest into any new models and that sort of thing? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. That's all for this week. Thank you so much for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next one. Later, guys.